Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the European Union's delegation to the United States to talk to Diego de Ojeda, who is the head of the unit that is coordinating the implementation of foreign security and defense policy at the European Commission. Sir, thanks very much for your time. It's at the end of a very long day. You're here in Washington on a whirlwind visit. We saw each other earlier today at an event at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. How are the talks going between yourself, EU, European Commission officials with U.S. officials? Because there seems to be a little bit of misunderstanding still regarding what the European Defense Initiative is, what the European Defense Fund is, and some of these efforts that are designed to improve, as I've heard Jorge Domecq tell me numerous times, the entire idea is to make Europe a better, stronger NATO partner and participant. Talk to us about where you are on the status of talks with folks in Washington.
Well, we're talking with folks in Washington, we're talking with American folks in Brussels with the U.S. mission over there, and our goal, as you rightly say, is to make sure that the U.S. fully grasps what we intend to do and is reassured that about what we intend to do. And to be fair, EU jargon is not so easy to understand, and things that are absolutely obvious for us, when read by people elsewhere, may lead to I wouldn't say suspicions, but at least some questions. So I would say that at least certainly today, it's fairly, we're making progress. But these are complex issues, and it's not so easy to get full satisfaction. And a lot of people or a lot of different units and services are involved on our side. We have the member states, we have the European Parliament, we have different departments in the Commission, the European Defense Agency you just mentioned. And the same goes for the US. You have defense, DOD, you have state, you have... So many actors, and each of these actors on both sides has different perspectives. So you have a certain interagency process here, but also home, and so it takes a bit of time to basically make sure that that they fully understand what we intend to do and get reassurance that in no way there is any sort of EU walking away from NATO, or even trying to duplicate NATO. On the contrary, our defense initiatives in the EU would not take place on the basis of a very unprecedented degree of cooperation between the EU and NATO that has been established since 2016.
How do you counter or address U.S. officials who look at, for example, some of the investment funds? There's $118 million in funding. The U.S. has said, expressed concerns about that. And one of the leading issues is, well, American industry should have complete fair access to all of these European programs. The European response is, if European taxpayers are going to invest in the development of technology, Europe has to be able to control that technology without Washington having export control approval over that. Where are you in that conversation with U.S. officials, given that European officials have said we're open to American industry participating, just not Washington having oversight ability over Europe's ability to export what are technologies that would be developed with European tax dollars?
Well, U.S. exports control rules on weapons are there for a reason, and we certainly don't want to get involved in how the U.S. should exercise export controls on the weapons systems that it produces. That's a U.S. debate, decision, process, whatever. But on the other hand, as you rightly say, if we incentivize the preparation or the research or the production of a technology by a number of European companies, what we cannot accept is that the product that has been incentivized by that EU taxpayers' funding would somehow be subject to controls by an outside party. Now, we're trying to put the two together and find a solution that will, from our end, ensure us that we will have the possibility to deploy that technology in the context of, for instance, the European Union has crisis management operations, let's say, in Mali, in Niger, whatever, in our neighborhood. We cannot, in order to deploy a technology, have to ask for permission or wait for any sort of authorization. That wouldn't make any sense. And the US says, well, of course, we would grant it. Right, well, we would like to have that certainty beforehand. That's the kind of stuff we're discussing, and I'm very hopeful that we are going to find a way through.
Where do you see, what are the important priorities from your standpoint? Excuse me, U.S. officials maintain that Europe should make maximum use of its extra defense spending, that there should be no investment to duplicate capabilities. And you've said, and every EU official has said, we want to avoid duplication of capability. How do you coordinate and synchronize this? Because, at the end of the day, nobody is being dictatorial. These are member nations. They have each their own needs. How do you see this synchronization and planning effort going to make sure that you're not duplicating capabilities at the end of the day, but are investing your money in the right ways?
Well, we do not go out and tell EU industry, now you should build a helicopter, or you should devote yourself to producing a new tank or a new plane. That's not our role. The strategic needs are defined by our member states. It so happens that the vast majority of our member states are members of NATO, or even if they're not members, they have a specific cooperation agreement with NATO. And therefore, NATO remains the only collective defense entity in the European continent. The EU is not about collective defense. It never has, and it never will. We're fundamentally different organization. So we may be complementary in some areas, but certainly not on collective defense. NATO remains the only interlocutor when it comes to collective defense of Europe. Now, it is in the context of NATO that the allies define the strategic priorities and what they need. Now, that filters to the EU arena, if I may say, through a number of strategic documents, etc., where we may add some additions for our specific purposes which are not related to collective defense, or we may not. And that will inform the priorities that will be the focus of our European Defence Fund. In other words, indirectly, it will be the allies of NATO, most of which are EU member states, that will come up and predetermine what the European Defence Fund will be funding, to the extent that the European industry is able to stand up to the challenge and come up with successful and interesting project proposals from an industrial point of view. Because we are not into subsidizing projects for the sake of whatever other reason. We are going to subsidize successfully industrial projects.
Is there a common understanding between Washington, right, because U.S. officials are saying, well, we don't want duplicative programs. Is there a clear idea you have about what Washington considers duplicative and what Europe might consider not duplicative? Because you can look at this from a sovereign preservation of capability standpoint. The UK, for example, is developing the Tempest program for its own combat aircraft sovereignty reasons, and Sweden and Italy are participating in that. In the case of Spain, Germany, and France, the French-led program, or I should say led by all three nations, right, commonly, but I mean France is in the lead along with Airbus on that program to develop a new combat aircraft capability, is seen as a sovereign effort. Is there an understanding on both sides of the Atlantic about what constitutes duplicative? Because one person's duplicative is another person's strategic investment.
if you have no duplication, then you have no competition. So there's a balance. You want a certain competition. Right now, we have in Europe a duplication of weapon systems among our member states, not with NATO, but among our member states. We have too many, whatever. So we need to make that more efficient. But we don't want to everybody doing just one thing and having no competition whatsoever. So there's a balance. But this question that you asked me is not relevant in the context of the European Defence Fund, at least at this stage. We're not in the process of producing those weapon systems, and we are never going to be, because the European Defence Fund will produce or will participate and will help in the development of capabilities, but up to the level of prototype. And by the way, we haven't even started. So, let's fine. That question may become more relevant in a few years from now. But right now, that's clearly not what we're doing.
From a strategic investment standpoint, there has been a lot of EU and EC focus on hybrid threats. NATO has been looking at this as well. I mean, if you look at the effective way in which Russia, for example, has undermined European politics, it's been extraordinary, whether involvement in the U.S. elections, whether it's involvement in Brexit, French politics, Spanish politics, or anywhere else, Italian politics in a very direct fashion. What are all of the sophisticated and not so sophisticated programs that have been launched in order to counter hybrid challenges, especially from disinformation, which is a weapon that's been used so effectively on the part of Moscow?
Well, this is a very strong focus of European Commission work, both countering hybrid threats and then specifically disinformation and cybersecurity as well. But it's also the focus of EU-NATO cooperation, where we are being told by NATO that the input of the EU, but in particular also of the European Commission, is vital, because we have a number of networks, let's say in terms of protecting critical infrastructures in Europe. We have those networks, not from a security or defense point of view, but from an infrastructural point of view, from an electricity point of view, from the grids. But you can add to that the defense or the hybrid component. But on the basis of the network we have, NATO doesn't have those networks. So by putting them, we are developing our own networks. We're making them more aware of the hybrid threat, but at the same time, we're putting them I wouldn't say at the service of NATO, but certainly to work in cooperation with NATO. And this translates on very tangible things. Like a few years ago, officials in NATO and in the Commission, they wouldn't be able to talk to each other. And there was no reason, frankly, to talk to each other. Now, when at the last massive cyber attack that there was, one of these global viruses, our experts on both sides immediately started tackling the threat together. This was already some time ago, but we're much better prepared. Are we fully prepared to counter all the range of possible hybrid threats? No, certainly not. And that's why we're developing this network, this effort alone and in cooperation with NATO. On a daily basis, basically, and we are making very good progress.
Last question on 5G. That is increasingly seen as one of the most critical technologies to develop for the future. The United States and Europe have had a robust, frank and candid conversation, I think, about the role of Huawei and Chinese companies in developing that next generation. U.S. concerned that that's an intelligence problem. Some of our allies believe that, but they also believe they have their own internal means to protect themselves. What's the right way to resolve this transatlantic issue? Is it, for example, to develop a transatlantic consortium or a transatlantic and trans-Pacific consortium of democratic nations that develop the technology and field it around the world, as opposed to be dependent on China and Huawei, for example? What's the right way forward here?
I wish I knew the answer. Probably wouldn't be here. No, jokes aside. this is not my field, first thing. But I know what we have done, and what we have done is we've taken note, very good note, of the U.S. concerns on this, and we have, together with our member states, as decided by the European Council, which is our supreme body, if I may say, we've asked member states to do a number of things, and right now, in a couple of weeks, we'll put out an assessment of what can be done and what ought to be done, and just keep watching.
And what's the message that you're taking to U.S. lawmakers? You're going to spend some time up on the Hill. You've been talking to folks, whether from DOD and from the White House and elsewhere. What are some of the key messages that you're delivering while you're here?
Well, I wish we could just focus on the technical aspects and to offer clarifications, and that those clarifications would be met with full or partial satisfaction from the U.S. side. And we're doing that. And it's going well, I would say. But we're also trying to reassure what I said earlier, that nothing of this would be happening without a very strong or an ever stronger EU-NATO cooperation. It is important. I would hope that one day this would be just boring and people say, okay, go ahead. But right now, I feel that at least in some quarters, they like to hear that the European Union is strongly committed to transatlantic partnership on security, and I don't have any problem in repeating that. So, and of course that there is no attempt to subject companies that are based in Europe, but that may have U.S. shareholders or partial shareholders to any discriminatory regime, just that they will be forced to comply to some very reasonable security-based conditions, just like EU companies, and it's that's what we're doing.
So effectively, if I just to paraphrase it, pretty much the same kind of standards that, for example, European companies have to operate when they're operating in the United States. The similar sort of regime would apply to American companies that would be operating in Europe in terms of safeguarding the access to technology to those who are investing in the development of that technology.
No, that's not what I meant. That might or might not be the case, that U.S. subsidiaries in Europe are treated the same way as EU subsidiaries in the U.S. We think it's fairly similar, but I don't know that much about the U.S. System. What I said is that we are trying to explain to our U.S. partners that U.S. defense subsidiaries in Europe, which are entities, as we call them, which are European entities because they're inscribed and they're registered in Europe. The only thing we're going to request from them is guarantees that they will be fully compliant with the same conditions as EU companies. So that for the fact that part of the capital or other factors are based, or their home companies are based, the mother companies are based in the US, they will comply with the same requirements of EDF just as if they were European. This implies a number of things, but they will not be in any way discriminatory. It's just, okay, give us full guarantees that you will operate just as a regular EU company, and that is doable.
One last question on ownership, because you raised that, which I think is an interesting issue. When I talk to EC and EU friends of mine, there has been mounting concern about Chinese investment in Europe, especially in key technology sectors, and that there is this perception and sense, wait a minute, we have to be a lot more strategic in terms of this investment. What's the right way from an EC level? How is the EC looking at this ownership issue, which is also becoming a challenge for the Pentagon as it looks through the ownership structures of a lot of Silicon Valley companies and is now increasingly concerned that, for example, Chinese companies and financial institutions make investments in Silicon Valley companies to take the technology back home? I know that senior European officials are also concerned about that, seeing as how Europe is a first-rate technology generator around the world, right? It's not just in Silicon Valley. There are a lot of innovative people, whether they're in Spain or whether they're in Italy or anywhere else in Europe. How's the EU looking at that challenging element, strategic element?
I wish I was in charge of that and I could answer that question too, but I'm not. As we said at the beginning, I'm coordination of defense, coordination of the implementation of defense policies in the European Commission. Now, what we've done in the recent past is that we've given ourselves a regime to scrutinize in a transparent manner foreign direct investment into Europe. This will allow us to at least have a much better picture of foreign direct investment coming from wherever it is, but obviously from outside of the EU, and to be able to raise a flag should there be security concerns. But as I said, this is not my field.
Diego de Ojeda, sir, thanks very much. Really appreciate it. Pleasure talking to you, and especially at the end of such a long day. I appreciate you making some time for us. Thanks very much, and good luck on the rest of your trip.
Thank you.